Chinese people are everywhere. You may have heard this phrase before, and there's certainly truth behind it. With over 40 million people of Chinese ancestry living across every country in the world, they constitute the world's third biggest diaspora. But what events led to so many Chinese fleeing their homeland? And where can you find the biggest Chinese communities in the world? Welcome to Sapiens Sapiens, the story of us. First up, we need to make something clear. China is diverse. What we call Han Chinese is actually a large umbrella term, including diverse subgroups such as the Yue, Hakka, and Hokkien peoples, each with their own unique Chinese languages and traditions. Keep this in mind as we go forward. The first wave of Chinese mass immigration began in the 10th century. Chinese merchants traveled all around Southeast Asia, establishing themselves in the port cities. Since most of these early Chinese merchants were male, they had to marry the local woman if they wanted any chance at love. The island of Luzon in the northern Philippines was one of the earliest hotspots for Chinese immigration, thanks to its proximity to China. Today we can actually find the oldest Chinatown in the world, located in central Manila. Most of the immigrants to the Philippines were the Minnan people from southern Fujian. It's difficult to determine exactly how many Filipinos today have at least partial Chinese ancestry, since in the official census to label yourself as Chinese, you need to have at least 75% Chinese ancestry. But it's safe to say that counting the centuries of assimilation, Filipinos with at least some Chinese ancestry would account for a massive part of the population, especially in the north. We simply can't know the full extent. Thailand is another country with great Chinese assimilation. People from the Chao Chan area started trading with the kingdom far back as the early 13th century. Today, the biggest Chinese overseas population is here in Thailand. 10 million people, comprising around 13% of Thailand's population. The Chinese have done a great job in assimilating into the local Thai culture, and today most Thais with Chinese ancestry identify solely as Thai. Even King Rama I, the founder of the current Chakri dynasty, was himself partly Chinese. Singapore is quite an interesting case in the region. After the island became a British trading port, the ethnic Malays were mostly opposed to working for the British. Britain turned elsewhere looking for laborers, thus bringing in a vast array of Indian and Chinese workers, mostly descended from the regions of Hokkien, Teochew, and Canton. Today, the Chinese account for a majority of Singapore's population, a whopping 75%, by far the biggest percentage in Southeast Asia. Other countries in Southeast Asia tell a different story. It's fair to say that the Chinese of Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei did not assimilate to the same extent as Thailand or the Philippines. Malaysian Chinese constitute around 23% of the population, descended mostly from the Hakka, Hokkien, and Cantonese. And just like in Singapore, they coexist along the native Malays and people of Indian descent. I found this comment very fascinating, talking about the Chinese in Malaysia. In Malaysia, you can pretty much say that many non-Chinese see the minority Chinese as the Jews of Southeast Asia, since most influential Chinese do fit the Jewish stereotypes, like their love for wealth, economic dominance, and persistence at keeping themselves separate from other non-Chinese in many domains, including education, residence, and trade. Not all Chinese are like that though, with many of them being extraordinarily ordinary, but the few who do have that stereotypical behavior are politically strong enough to exert this kind of perception. If you are from Malaysia, let me know if you agree with this sentiment. The fascinating thing about Malaysian Chinese is that each individual subgroup has preserved their traditions fairly well, probably even better preserved than in mainland China after the Cultural Revolution. These are vibrant communities that, although sharing a common nationality now, are still culturally distinct than their Indian and Malay neighbors. The financial and political representation of the Chinese in several Southeast Asian countries has sometimes led to resentment from the native populations. This was the case in Indonesia in the 1998 riots, where the local Indonesians in big cities like Jakarta, Surakarta, and Medan attacked their Chinese neighbors and looted their businesses. How Chinese Indonesians, or Chindos as they're called, are treated really depends on where they live. And although the younger generations tend to be less racist, There still exists a big us versus them mentality between native Indonesians and Chindos, which might actually be more due to religious differences than ethnicity. Native Indonesians are overwhelmingly Muslim, while Chindos are mostly Buddhist or Christian. After the 1945 Indonesian Revolution, some Chindos emigrated back to China and Hong Kong. Others migrated to Western countries, and although they can still trace their Chinese ancestry, many of these Chindos consider themselves more Indonesian than Chinese. Of course, any talking about Southeast Asia would be incomplete without mentioning Taiwan, which starting in the 13th century was receiving a lot of Chinese immigrants, and their takeover of the island was so effective that today Taiwan is mostly composed of Han Chinese, and the aboriginal peoples of the island, which we call Austronesians, are only a small percentage. But it's not all sad news. These Austronesians from Taiwan eventually spread all throughout Southeast Asia, into Vietnam, into Malaysia, into the Philippines, Oceania, and even as far as Madagascar. This process of the Han Chinese overtaking another culture and assimilating into it is called the Sinicization. It's quite a difficult word. Sinicization. I cannot stress enough how the experience of Chinese immigrants or people of Chinese descent varies from country to country. Each Southeast Asian country deserves its own video to do the topic justice. Suffice to say, China has had a tremendous impact on all of this region, and I'm sure it will continue to do so in centuries to come. The Chinese explorer Zheng He made a direct contact with Africa back in the 15th century on the coast of what is now Kenya. And in the last century, China has deepened their economic ties with several African countries. Most Chinese immigrants coming to Africa are therefore economic opportunities, hired by Chinese companies to work on African infrastructure. Estimates put the number of Chinese immigrants in Africa at over 1 million, with 1/4 of them being in South Africa. It will be fascinating to see how the Chinese influence and assimilate with the local people. Will they keep mostly to themselves, or are we gonna see the emergence of a Chinese African fused culture? Only time will tell, but I'm excited to see it. 1849. A glimmering pebble is found in the rivers of California. It's gold. News of this spreads across the world and eventually reaches the coast of China. By the year 1880, there are more than 100,000 Chinese immigrants in the United States. Most of the early immigrants were men, working not only in the mines but also in the construction of railroads all across western United States. Over time, some Chinese became wealthy entrepreneurs, and just like in Southeast Asia, resentment started rising from the locals. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was put into motion, being the first law in the United States meant to curtail immigration. It would by no means be the last. Today, there are more than 5 million Chinese Americans, 1.5% of the population. You can find the biggest Chinese communities in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York, each one hosting vibrant Chinatowns. I remember when I visited New York, I was blown away by the Flushing's neighborhood in Queens, which felt like an entirely different country. It's quite amazing actually, and New York City itself has the biggest Chinese population outside of China anywhere in the world. During the first wave of discrimination in the US, many Chinese went south to Mexico on an invitation by the Mexican government to help build the railroads in the north. Sadly, they would also suffer discrimination by the native population. Today, 70,000 Mexicans are of Chinese descent, and you can actually find the biggest community in Mexicali, where you can explore underground tunnels used by early immigrants to hide themselves from the scourging desert heat. Similar stories repeat themselves across Latin America and the Caribbean, with Chinese immigrants arriving for economic opportunities and marrying the local woman. You can find the biggest Chinese communities in Peru, Brazil, and Venezuela. I would say that the Chinese in the Americas have assimilated quite well. Immigration into Europe has been more recent, and you can find the biggest Chinese communities in the UK, Spain, and France. Also, Australia has become a fairly popular destination, especially in Sydney. Since their first mass expeditions out of their homeland back in the 10th century, the Chinese have adapted to life in every continent, proving to be a resilient people. So next time you enjoy a savory plate of dim sum, remember the story of the Chinese. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I started this channel because of my fascination with human migrations. So if you like learning about the human story and culture, join me on my adventure and maybe subscribe if you want to. And don't forget to leave a like so this channel goes out to more people. This has been your host, Sauce. I'll see you next time.